The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like trapped wasps as Margaret Walsh moved through Oak Creek Memorial's ICU at 3 in the morning, her shadow stretching and shrinking beneath each panel. 37 years old, graying hair pulled back in a practical bun, sensible shoes worn thin at the heels from 3 years of double shifts without complaint. Just a night nurse. That's what the day staff called her? That's what Dr. Caldwell would see when he arrived for rounds in 4 hours. He wouldn't see the way her hands moved with surgical precision when starting fours, each movement economical, almost violent in its efficiency. He wouldn't see the military hospital corners on every bed she made, exact 90-degree angles, sheets pulled so tight you could bounce a coin off them. He wouldn't see what those hands had held. He wouldn't see the dog tag on a broken chain hidden beneath her scrubs, cold against her collarbone, or the shoebox at home containing Major's oak leaves wrapped in faded tissue paper, or the legend whispered in Ramadi about a surgeon named Walsh who carried 3 wounded Marines 3 miles through mortar fire. The ICU smelled like antiseptic and exhaled breath, like plastic tubing and the particular staleness of recycled hospital air at the hour when most people dream. Margaret adjusted a ventilator on bed 4, her fingers finding the settings without conscious thought. Pressure control mode. PEEP at 8. Respiratory rate 14. The machine wheezed its mechanical rhythm, steady as a heartbeat that wasn't her own. She checked the 4 lines next, her eyes moving with the methodical precision of someone who had done this exact sequence 12,000 times. Line patent. Medication drip running on time. Lab values trending the right direction. Small victories in the darkness. She didn't notice herself touching the dog tag chain beneath her collar, a habitual gesture, a reassurance that the past was still there, still real, still hers. Break room coffee at 0330 was thick and bitter. Margaret sat alone at the small table by the window, watching Houston skyline blink like a sleeping city. The other nurses had long since learned not to sit with her. Something about her posture discouraged conversation, the way she held herself upright even in exhaustion, the way her eyes tracked the ICU floor through the glass wall as if her attention was never truly absent. She drank the coffee black. No sugar. No cream. Just the bitter taste and the familiar ritual. This was her 4th night in a row. Tomorrow would be her 5th. The money was good, hazard pay for the graveyard shifts, plus the overtime that nobody else wanted. She needed it. The apartment rent in Houston wasn't getting any cheaper, and the physical therapy bills still arrived every month, even though she'd stopped going 6 months ago. You either healed or you learned to live with the limp. Margaret had chosen the latter. The ICU doors burst open at 0547, 30 minutes before official rounds. Dr. Caldwell entered like he owned the hospital, which, as of 2 weeks ago, the administration had basically told him that he did. New ICU director. Yale graduate. Published researcher. Recommendations from Johns Hopkins and the Mayo Clinic. He was 45, maybe 50, with a kind of groomed appearance that suggested someone for whom appearance mattered deeply. His watch probably cost more than Margaret made in 3 months. She noticed these things. 3 years of careful observation had made her good at reading people quickly. The new director scanned the ICU with an expression somewhere between satisfaction and contempt, as if he were surveying animals in a zoo that needed better management. Margaret didn't stand. She continued her notes on the computer terminal, her movements unhurried, her body language displaying what she'd learned long ago was the correct balance, present but not obtrusive, competent but not threatening, visible but not memorable. She'd spent 2 decades perfecting this exact posture. It was muscle memory of a different kind. Dr. Caldwell approached her station with a hand extended. His handshake was firm, the kind of firmness that was meant to communicate dominance. Margaret shook his hand once and released, her grip steady, her eye contact brief. Professional. Deferential. Exactly what he expected. Margaret Walsh, she said quietly. Night shift. Dr. Caldwell. I'm assuming you've read the new ICU protocols. Yes, doctor. Implemented yesterday. Good. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. His eyes were already cataloguing her, filing her away in the same mental drawer where he kept people he could safely ignore. We'll need to discuss staffing adjustments. I notice some inefficiencies in the current rotation. Margaret nodded and said nothing. Silence was its own form of agreement. At 0612, the ambulance alert sounded. A single tone, urgent but not panicked. Code activation for incoming trauma. The ICU staff moved with the practiced choreography of people who had rehearsed this dance 100 times. Margaret's eyes went to the monitor, watching the dispatch information scroll across the screen. Male, 34 years old, multiple gunshot wounds sustained during an armed robbery in downtown Houston. ETA for minutes. Status: critical. Blood pressure 80/42. Oxygen saturation 68%. Conscious but unresponsive to commands. The trauma bay doors opened at 0616. The paramedics rolled the stretcher through with the controlled urgency of people moving cargo that was actively dying. The patient was already intubated, a breathing tube down his throat, his chest rising and falling in sync with the ventilator bag. Margaret caught sight of his face and something in her chest stopped. His face was an adult version of something she'd last seen through the sights of an M16 rifle, a child's face twisted in terror during a compound raid in Ramadi in 2004. 8 years old. Eyes wide. Screaming in Arabic. There had been 2 minutes, maybe 3, between the moment the breech charge blew the compound door and the moment the bullets started finding their targets. In those minutes, Margaret had moved from the stairwell to the courtyard. She'd seen the child. She'd pulled him down, covered him with her own body, felt the rounds punch through her left side, felt the heat of her own blood mixing with his sweat. The child had lived. The medevac had come. He'd been transferred through the system, orphaned, classified, probably adopted through military channels given the paperwork she'd later seen in classified files marked restricted. Now he was 34. Now he had a scar above his left eyebrow that hadn't been there before, a thin white line that caught the overhead lights. Now he was being wheeled into her ICU with his chest full of bullets. Margaret's hand moved to the patient board. Dr. Caldwell was assigning bed assignments, barking orders with the confidence of someone who had never experienced uncertainty. The patient's name printed across the monitors in stark white letters, Jackson. No first name available yet. Classification pending. Military notation in the upper right corner. She traced the name on the board with one trembling finger and pulled back immediately, aware that she was breaking protocol, aware that accessing his chart without explicit clinical assignment was a violation of HIPAA, aware that she needed to know what had happened to him in the 20 years since Ramadi. Her hands moved across the keyboard with the kind of quiet urgency reserved for moments when the world's architecture begins to shift. A single click brought up his file. Jackson. First name Michael. Age 34. Military designation, Special Forces, JSOC. Active duty status, classified. Last physical examination, marked abnormal. Experimental medication trials flagged, Caldwell's signature on 3 separate authorization forms. Medical clearances marked complete but submitted dates prior to examination completion. Medication side effects not listed in official records. Everything squared into neat little boxes, all the edges too clean, too perfect, arranged with the precision of a lie dressed up in bureaucratic language. Dr. Caldwell's voice cut across the bay like a knife. Walsh. Step away from that terminal. Margaret's fingers went still. She didn't turn around. She didn't stand up quickly. She counted to 2, then turned her chair with the kind of deliberate slowness that communicated she'd been interrupted mid-task, not mid-crime. Her eyes met his. Calm. Steady. Exactly the expression of someone who had just been reviewing her patient assignments. Doctor? Her voice was soft, requiring him to listen carefully to hear it. A skill. Patient confidentiality protocols. You're not assigned to this bed yet. I was checking the incoming assignments, Doctor. Making sure I understood the triage. It wasn't entirely a lie. It was a particular arrangement of truth that allowed for deniability. She'd learned this from military legal briefs, from interrogators in forward operating bases, from the men who explained to her why she couldn't talk about what she'd seen in Ramadi. Dr. Caldwell's expression shifted, something calculating moving behind his eyes. He'd seen her accessing the file. He knew she'd seen the experimental drug trials, the falsified clearances, the entire architecture of whatever arrangement had been made with Michael Jackson. And now he was calculating whether she was a threat or an asset, whether she would be silent or loud, whether she needed to be managed or eliminated. Hospital policy, he said slowly, his voice dropping into a register that was almost friendly. All chart access is logged. I'll have IT pull the report. Just protocol, you understand. Of course, Doctor, Margaret said. She turned back to the monitor and continued her notes with the kind of mechanical precision that suggested the conversation was already forgotten. But beneath the desk, her right hand was shaking. Not with fear. With recognition. With the terrible understanding that she'd just seen a ghost, and that the ghost had been carefully arranged to arrive at her hospital, in her ICU, on her shift, exactly like this. Behind her, Dr. Caldwell watched for another 5 seconds. Then he turned toward the incoming patient and began barking orders, his voice carrying the tone of someone who had just made a decision about something far larger than hospital protocol. The ambulance alert sounded again at 0618. Another incoming. Margaret didn't look up from her work, but she felt the moment shift, felt the machinery of the hospital begin its terrible acceleration toward something neither of them could stop anymore. The bulletin board posted during morning shift change. Margaret saw it the moment she entered the nurse's station at 0645, the white paper with its hospital seal catching the fluorescent light like a target. Margaret Walsh, improper chart access, violation of HIPAA protocol, formal reprimand. 20 staff members filtered past the board, reading. Some glanced at her. Most didn't. Dr. Caldwell stood at the center of the huddle, chart in hand, his voice carrying across the station with surgical precision. Florence Nightingale here thought she could review classified files without authorization. He smiled at the gathered nurses. Perhaps at her age, we need to review basic computer training. A few nurses exchanged glances. One looked away. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant drone above, indifferent to everything happening below. Margaret stood at the medication cart, her hand steady as she logged into the dispensing system. She did not look at Caldwell. She did not look at the board. She looked at the 4 labels she was pulling, 0400 dose for room for 12, antibiotic, 6-hour intervals starting at 2,200 as originally ordered. Her jaw was a line of stone. Her breathing was controlled, the way you learned to breathe in Ramadi when the mortars were close enough that you could feel the percussion in your chest cavity. A single tear escaped down her weathered cheek. She wiped it without breaking eye contact with the medication vial in her hand. No one saw it except for the security camera mounted in the corner, its red light blinking its mechanical witness. By afternoon, the reassignment had been processed. Night shift. Pediatrics. Effective immediately. The unit clerk handed Margaret the new schedule on paper that felt heavier than it should, her eyes carefully averted, the way people look away from accidents on the highway. Margaret took the schedule and nodded once. She did not speak. At 17:30, Margaret entered the break room for her shift transition lunch. The room smelled of microwaved something and stale coffee, the kind that had been sitting in the pot long enough to develop a film. Nurse Chen sat at the corner table with her Tupperware container of rice and grilled chicken. She looked up at Margaret's entrance, and something flickered across her face, not quite pity, not quite fear. She gathered her lunch and stood. "Gotta get back," she said to no one in particular. Nurse Rodriguez was next. Then Patel. Then Morrison. Within 90 seconds, Margaret sat alone at a table built for 6, the chairs still warm from where they had been sitting moments before, their absence more present than their presence had ever been. The hum of the refrigerator. The tick of the clock. The sound of her own breathing, steady and controlled. Dr. Caldwell appeared in the doorway, his white coat crisp, his expression a portrait of concern, the kind of concern that predators wear when they want you to know they are enjoying the hunt. He stood there for 7 seconds, arms crossed, watching her sit alone. His satisfaction was visible in the slight upturn at the corners of his mouth. Then he turned and left, his footsteps echoing down the hallway like a metronome counting down to something neither of them could stop. The next morning, during rounds. Jackson's room. His foster parents had arrived at 0800, a middle-aged couple with worried eyes and the bearing of people who had learned long ago that the world was not kind to children like Jackson. They stood at the foot of his bed while Dr. Caldwell performed his examination, his movements theatrical, his words chosen with the precision of a blade. "Ms. Walsh, can you explain why you administered the antibiotic at 0400 instead of 0600 as ordered?" He held up the medication chart, his voice pitched to carry beyond the room, designed for an audience. The foster parents' faces tensed. Margaret's hands did not shake. "The order reads Q6H starting at 2200. That makes 0400 correct, Doctor." Her voice was steady, a baseline measurement against his escalation. He turned to the foster parents with theatrical concern, his tone shifting to something that sounded almost paternal. "You see how defensive she gets? This is why experience without adaptability becomes dangerous. Assumptions. Shortcuts." He shook his head with the disappointment of a man watching someone fail to understand something obvious. Sometimes the most experienced nurses are the most dangerous precisely because they think they know better than protocol. The foster mother's face filled with worry. The foster father's hand tightened on her shoulder. Margaret's jaw had become a single muscle, contracted and holding. Her breathing had changed, shallow now, controlled, the way you breathe when the mortar rounds are close and you are counting the seconds between impact and the next one coming. She updated the chart with movements that were precise and clinical, each keystroke exact, each notation correct. Everything she did was perfect. Everything she did was watched. Everything she did was wrong in his presence simply by virtue of being done by her hands. "Thank you, Ms. Walsh," he said, dismissing her with a glance that lingered just long enough to confirm she had noticed his dismissal. "I'm sure pediatrics will be a better fit for your current level of engagement." She left the room without response, without eye contact, without giving him anything except the confirmation that his words had landed. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't what twisted in her chest as she walked past the nurse's station and saw her new schedule posted, pediatrics, night shift, effective immediately, starting tonight. The hospital had moved her like a chess piece, and she had allowed it because the alternative was to break her own rule, the one she'd built over 5 years of learning to walk without limping, 5 years of becoming Margaret the quiet night nurse instead of Major Walsh, who no longer existed in a body that had failed her when she needed it most. Her new assignment meant she could see Jackson only from the hallway. Could watch his room from a distance. Could monitor his oxygen saturation numbers on the unit board and know that his fever was spiking, fever at 103.2 as of 1600, and know that his blood pressure was dropping incrementally with each passing hour. Could see the clinical decline in the vital signs column without being able to do anything about it because she was no longer authorized to be in his room. Because Dr. Caldwell had erased her from his care with the same precision he had used to erase her from the break room, the nurse's station, the professional world she had spent 3 years rebuilding. In the IT office on the 3rd floor, Marcus Chen sat at his monitor array, watching the security logs scroll past. His left hand was a OSHA prosthetic, state-of-the-art titanium and silicone, designed to mimic natural movement. The right hand moved across the keyboard with the muscle memory of someone who had once carried a rifle with both hands intact. He had served with 75th Ranger Regiment before an IED in Panjwai district had taken the left one clean at the wrist. He had watched the security camera footage and seen Margaret access Jackson's classified file. More importantly, he had watched Dr. Caldwell's remote login appear 3 seconds later, a digital shadow checking what Margaret had seen before locking her out of the system entirely. Marcus's fingers flew across the keyboard, creating encrypted backup files of everything, the classified medical records, the pharmaceutical company correspondence, the falsified clearances, all of it copied to an external drive that he kept in a locked drawer beneath his desk. He had learned a long time ago that sometimes you backed up the truth because the truth had a way of disappearing when the wrong people noticed it floating around where it didn't belong. He bookmarked the timestamp, 1447. Margaret's access, 1447. Caldwell's check, 1450. 3 minutes. That's all it took for a doctor to know that someone had seen something they weren't supposed to see. At 2300, Margaret arrived for her night shift in pediatrics. The ward was quiet, the way pediatric ICUs become quiet after visiting hours end, a hushed, careful quiet where children slept in rooms with monitors watching their every breath. Her new assignment meant hours of caring for patients whose names she would learn in passing, whose family she would never know, whose cases would not stay with her because she had been transferred to forget about Jackson as much as to punish her for accessing his file. But that's when the shift supervisor found her in the medication room. Your schedule's changed again. Dr. Caldwell wants you on the adult floor. Night float. Starting tomorrow. The supervisor handed her the new paper without meeting her eyes, the way people hand over documents they wish they didn't have to deliver. Says you're too experienced for pediatrics. Wants you covering the entire hospital after hours. Night float. The worst shift. The lonely shift. The shift where you were spread too thin across too many patients, where backup was 20 minutes away if you needed it, where you managed crises alone because that was what night float meant. You were the nurse everyone called when something went wrong and there was no one else to answer. It was brilliant in its cruelty. Brilliant in how it isolated her even more completely than pediatrics would have. Brilliant in how it kept her moving, shifting, unable to focus on anything except survival. She touched the dog tag beneath her scrubs. The metal was cold against her chest, separated from her body by 2 layers of fabric, hidden the way she was hidden, the way she had made herself small and forgettable and ordinary for 5 years. The chain was broken, had been broken since Ramadi, held together now only by the weight of what it had meant when she last wore it openly, when she had been something more than a nurse, when her hands had held authority instead of just holding people together as they died. In Dr. Caldwell's office on the 2nd floor, he ended a call on his desk phone, his voice dropping to something almost conspiratorial. Yes, transfer her anywhere. I don't care. Just get her away from that patient before she figures out why he's really here. He smiled at something the person on the other end said, a smile that suggested he was already 3 moves ahead of everyone else on the board. He hung up and opened his desk drawer, where a prescription pad lay alongside a list of pharmaceutical company contacts. His handwriting was perfect, his intentions perfectly clear, his conspiracy perfectly protected because no one was looking hard enough to see it. The temperature in the room seemed to drop by several degrees. Margaret's shoes echoed against the tile as she pushed through the glass doors of Oak Creek Memorial's ICU wing. The night shift. 3 weeks of night shift now, ever since Dr. Caldwell had reassigned her with a pen stroke and a smile that looked like a predator showing its teeth. The fluorescent lights above cast everything in that sickly blue-white that made 0300 feel like the bottom of an ocean. Her badge hung heavy against her ribs. Heavier than usual. Jackson's chart was flagged red on the monitor. She didn't have to look far, Dr. Caldwell had made sure of that. The chart position on the display was a message in itself. A warning. A line drawn across the sand. Margaret pulled it up anyway, her fingers moving through the digital pages with the precision of someone who'd been reading medical data for more than 2 decades. Fever spiking to 103.7. Blood cultures pending. The experimental drug trial complications were beginning their work on his body like a slow-motion car crash. She could see it in the numbers, white blood cell count elevated, kidney function declining, liver enzymes climbing. His body was failing. Systematically. Like someone was methodically dismantling him from the inside. The notes from day shift were sparse. Standard vital monitoring. No interventions beyond basic supportive care. No one was acting like this was a man in crisis. No one was acting like Jackson was dying. Margaret closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds, a technique she'd learned 20 years ago in a combat support hospital where soldiers taught you that a blink was all the rest you'd ever get, and then she moved toward his room. The ICU hummed with the sound of 10 patients on life support. 10 monitors beeping their individual rhythms like a broken orchestra. Jackson's room was at the end of the west corridor, and she could see his silhouette through the glass partition, the shape of him still and wrong under the white sheets. She was 3 steps from his door when the monitor alarm screamed. Not a gentle alert tone. Not the soft chime that meant a parameter had drifted slightly out of range. This was a code blue scream. This was the sound of a human body's electrical system tearing itself apart. It was 0347. Margaret's body moved before her mind caught up. Her hand slammed the elevator call button behind her as alarms erupted through the entire ICU wing, one room's crisis triggering every monitor, every light, every nerve in the space to fire at once. The intercom crackled, "Code Blue, ICU 7, Code Blue, ICU 7, and the ceiling lights flickered in a synchronized panic that made the whole unit feel like it was having its own seizure. Her heart rate was already climbing, her breathing already shifting from civilian rhythm to combat rhythm, that controlled deep belly breathing that kept oxygen flowing to the brain when everything else was screaming. She was moving through Jackson's door before the overhead page finished repeating. The first-year resident, she recognized him, had seen him on morning rounds with that careful uncertainty in his movements, was already at the bedside, his hands fumbling with the laryngoscope. His face was the color of hospital walls. Panicked. New. Not ready for this. Jackson's body was rigid on the bed, his back arching in a convulsion that came from the depths of his chest, and his monitor showed the reason why: ventricular tachycardia, a deadly rhythm, his heart beating so fast and so chaotic that it couldn't actually pump blood. The oxygen saturation dropped from 88 to 85 to 82 as Margaret watched. Every second his blood wasn't moving, his brain was losing cells. Every second, he was dying. She saw it before anyone else. The left side of his chest wasn't rising with the resident's bagging. The trachea was deviated to the right, she could see the angle of his neck, the slight unnaturalness of it. His neck veins were bulging like rope, the jugular veins distended and pulsing, the telltale sign of a tension pneumothorax. His right lung had collapsed and the air that escaped was compressing his heart, crushing his lungs, stealing his blood pressure like a thief in the dark. "He needs a needle decompression," Margaret said. Her voice didn't shake. That was something they'd trained out of her in Ramadi, that useless tremor that got soldiers killed. Her voice came out level as a surgeon's. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Now. The resident looked at her like she'd spoken in another language. His hands were still wrapped around the laryngoscope. He didn't move. The monitor screamed. The oxygen number fell, 81. 79. Other nurses were running now, the crash cart wheels squeaking against the floor like metal animals in distress, the sound mixing with the monitor alarms in a symphony of catastrophe. Margaret could see the attending physician wasn't in the room yet. Caldwell was at the nurse's station, visible through the glass partition, one hand holding a phone, the other resting on the counter as he watched the chaos unfold. His expression was the expression of a man watching a chess game he'd set in motion hours ago. Controlled. Knowing. Patient. Margaret's hand reached for the medication cabinet before anyone else moved. A 14-gauge needle, the largest they had, needed for the thick muscle and fascia of the chest wall. She could see where it needed to go like a map on her skin, a map written 20 years ago in a combat hospital where she'd learned that sometimes the only way to save a life was to make it worse before it got better. You punctured the chest to release the pressure. You hurt the body to save the brain. You did the thing that looked like destruction and called it rescue. "Ms. Walsh, you are not assigned to this unit." Dr. Caldwell's voice cut across the room like a blade. He'd arrived in the doorway with the kind of timing that suggested he'd been waiting for her to move, waiting for her to break protocol, waiting for this exact moment. His eyes were narrowed with satisfaction. "You are not assigned to this patient. Step away from that bed immediately or I will have security remove you from the premises." Margaret's hands didn't stop moving. She'd torn open the sterile packaging for the needle, the wrapper making that crinkly sound that seemed impossibly loud in the screaming room. The attending physician was still 2 minutes away. She'd heard the overhead page go out, had heard the footsteps in the corridor picking up pace, but 2 minutes was a lifetime when a man's oxygen was at 77 and falling. 2 minutes was the difference between recovery and brain death. 2 minutes was the difference between Jackson living as the man he'd become and Jackson living as a body with no one home inside it. "No, doctor." Margaret pulled the dog tag from beneath her scrubs. The broken chain caught the fluorescent light, the metal dulled from decades of wear, from desert sun and blood and sweat and the hands of an 8-year-old boy who'd gripped it like it was the last thing tethering him to life. She let it hang visible. "Let him see it. You step away." The room froze. Not in silence. The monitors still screamed, the crash cart still squeaked, the ventilator still wheezed, but in that deeper kind of stillness that comes when everyone in a space suddenly realizes they're standing in the presence of something they don't fully understand. The resident's hands lowered. The second nurse paused mid-movement. Even the alarm seemed to recede into the background, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Margaret found the space between Jackson's ribs. The needle slid in like a key turning in a lock, that precise angle she'd practiced 10,000 times, and she felt the resistance of the muscle fibers part around the metal, felt the sudden give when the needle broke through the fascia and into the potential space where air was crushing his heart. The hiss of air escaping came immediately, a sound like relief itself, like pressure releasing, like a sigh from the body of a dying man given one more chance. The monitor changed. The saturation began to climb. 78, 81. 85, the rhythm was still wild, still dangerous, still ventricular tachycardia, but now his heart had room to beat, room to pump blood, room to keep his brain alive while the attending physician arrived and took over the code. Margaret pulled the needle back carefully, secured a small chest seal from the crash cart, the improvised kind, made from the adhesive backing of a sterile dressing, and pressed it over the needle site. The seal held. The air stopped escaping. The monitor showed oxygen climbing toward 90. She stepped back from the bed and looked directly at Dr. Caldwell. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet. Controlled. The voice of someone who'd given orders in combat zones where a tremor in the words could get people killed. "I need some jello," she said. "I'll be in the break room." The alarm stopped screaming the moment the needle went in. Margaret's hands moved before thought could catch up. 14-gauge angiocath needle, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, skin tenting under tension like a drum about to split. She found the landmark with the precision of someone who'd done this in darkness under mortar fire. One fluid motion. The needle penetrated the pleural space. Air hissed out like a trap breath finally released, and Jackson's oxygen saturation climbed off the floor, 85%, 88%, 92%, the monitor beeping its grateful rhythm as his chest wall relaxed and his lungs remembered how to expand. "Bag him at 15 per minute." Her voice had changed. The tremor was gone. What came out was clipped, authoritative, the cadence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. 2 large-bore 4s. "Hang the pressers. Move." The ICU staff responded before their brains caught up to the contradiction. Nurses who minutes ago had watched her stand silently through Dr. Caldwell's public humiliation now moved on her command like she'd been barking orders her entire career. Because she had. Her hands worked with mechanical precision, adjusting Jackson's position, monitoring the manual ventilation, every movement economical and purposeful. No wasted motion. No uncertainty. The attending physician arrived mid-crisis, took in the scene in one sweeping glance, and stepped back from the bedside. He recognized what he was watching. A professional at work. Margaret's uniform was soaked through, Jackson's blood, her own sweat, the acrid smell of adrenaline and antiseptic mixing in the recirculated hospital air. She kept the bag valve mask moving in steady rhythm, 15 compressions per minute, the sound of latex against plastic the only noise that mattered. Jackson's lips were losing their cyanotic tint. His pupils were reactive. She'd done this before, maintained life through nothing but mechanical advantage and stubborn refusal to let the body in front of her become another name on a roster. In Ramadi, she'd improvised a chest seal from an MRE package when standard supplies ran out during a convoy ambush, and muscle memory didn't distinguish between a special forces operator bleeding out in a desert and a boy she'd once protected in a compound raid, now grown into that same uniform, dying on her watch. Her left hand worked steady while her right adjusted the oxygen flow. The attending was staring at her with an expression that said he was recalculating everything he'd witnessed. Hands that had held lives together. Hands steady as surgical lasers. Not the hands of a night shift nurse filling prescriptions and checking vitals. Someone get me a chest seal. MRE packaging works if we have it. Tape. Gauze. Now. The words weren't a request. They were a command. A resident ran. Margaret's breathing didn't change. Her focus didn't waver. 20 years of learning to move through hospitals like a civilian, and it took 5 minutes of a medical crisis to strip away the disguise and reveal what had always been underneath. The quiet nurse who moved through the night shift like a ghost was gone. In her place stood someone who spoke in the dialect of combat medicine, who understood that pain was data and shock was mathematics and a human body was a complex hydraulic system that could be held together through nothing but will and knowledge and hands that didn't hesitate. The chest seal was applied. Jackson's vitals stabilized. O2 sat climbing toward 98%. Margaret was still manually bagging him when she heard the door open and Dr. Caldwell's voice cut through the organized chaos like a scalpel. Everyone out. Now. The room cleared in seconds. Only Margaret remained at the bedside, one hand maintaining the rhythm of the bag valve mask, the other monitoring Jackson's carotid pulse. She didn't look at Dr. Caldwell. Didn't acknowledge the 2 security guards flanking him or the HR director standing beside the door with a folder already tucked under her arm. Margaret kept working. Kept Jackson alive. That was the only calculus that mattered. Your heroics don't excuse insubordination. Dr. Caldwell's voice was smooth as silk, controlled, the voice of someone who'd already calculated the victory. You accessed restricted files. Violated your reassignment. Practiced beyond your scope. You're terminated effective immediately for protocol violations and willful disobedience of direct orders. He slid papers across the bedside table, careful to avoid the equipment. Everything proper. Everything documented. Everything legal. Margaret finally looked at him, and something flickered across his face, a moment of uncertainty when he met her eyes. Then it passed. She removed her gloves. Signed the termination papers without reading them. Each signature was steady, each letter formed with absolute control. No tremor. No hesitation. The only thing that might have betrayed her was the slight pause when her eyes caught Jackson's unconscious face one final time. Still breathing. Still alive because of her. The dog tag beneath her scrubs felt suddenly heavier, the broken chain pressing against her chest like an accusation. Security will escort you out, Caldwell said. Margaret turned toward the door, but at the threshold she turned back. Just for a moment. Just long enough to look at the boy she'd carried through enemy fire 20 years ago, the boy she'd just saved again, the boy she would never see recover. She touched the dog tag through her shirt, one final time, and walked out of the ICU without looking back. The parking garage at 0512 was empty except for her car and the fluorescent lights casting everything in sickly yellow. Margaret sat behind the steering wheel, engine dead, forehead pressed against the cold plastic. Her phone was already buzzing. She didn't need to read it to know, eviction notice. Final warning. 3 months of medical bills she couldn't pay. 5 years of civilian wages that hadn't covered the gap between surviving and living. Her phone buzzed again. Then again. Messages stacking up like an avalanche she couldn't stop. She'd spent 2 decades learning to be someone forgettable. Someone small. Someone who could disappear into a hospital's night shift and forget that Major Margaret Walsh had ever carried 3 wounded soldiers 3 miles through enemy fire. That she'd earned a Silver Star for valor that had spent 20 years in a shoebox under her bed. That the dog tag around her neck represented a life she'd traded away because her body had failed her, had shattered under an IED blast in Ramadi, and she couldn't be a soldier anymore, so she'd become nothing instead. 5 hours. That's all it had taken to demolish 5 years of meticulous reconstruction. One crisis. One moment where the old Margaret had surfaced and the new one had cracked completely. Now she sat in a parking garage at dawn with no job, no apartment starting next month, and no way to fight a system that had decided she was disposable. But that wasn't the worst part. At 0900, exactly 5 hours after Margaret had saved Jackson's life, the day nurse was adjusting his fore when his eyes opened. Conscious. Aware. Tracking movement. His hand moved toward the call button, but then he stopped, his entire body going rigid as his eyes locked on the empty space where Margaret had been standing. "Where is Major Walsh?" His voice was rough from intubation, barely a whisper, but it carried absolute certainty. Not the nurse. Not the woman. Major Walsh. Like he'd been waiting for something, or someone, for 20 years. The day nurse froze. "I'm sorry, who?" Jackson's trembling hand pulled his dog tags aside, and there it was, a faded scar tissue puckering across his chest, old enough to be from childhood, the kind of scar that came from something catastrophic that had somehow missed killing him. The nurse. Grey hair. Limp. "She saved me. Where is she?" The charge nurse called Dr. Caldwell immediately. He arrived within minutes, his face arranged in professional concern, but Margaret could see it, the micro-expression of panic he tried to bury. Jackson locked eyes with him, and his voice hardened with sudden clarity. "Bring her back. Now. I don't care what happened. Bring her back." At 0923, the ICU doors burst open to the percussion of military boots on tile, 1, 2, 3, facets hitting the floor in perfect synchronized rhythm. A SEAL team leader in full dress uniform strode through, sleeve cuff reading JSOC, 3 operators flanking him with the bearing of men who'd spent careers moving through hostile territory. They didn't acknowledge Dr. Caldwell. Didn't nod at the nurses. They moved directly to Jackson's bedside with the efficiency of a search team that had already found what they were looking for. "Captain Jackson Cruz, JSOC sends regards." The SEAL's voice could cut glass. "We're extracting you to Walter Reed within the hour." Then he turned, scanning the room with the intensity of someone searching for a specific face. His eyes passed over Dr. Caldwell without registering his existence. "Where is Major Margaret Walsh?" Dr. Caldwell stepped forward, hand extended, his voice still smooth, but now there was an edge to it, the sound of ground shifting underneath him. "I'm Dr. Caldwell, ICU Director. The nurse in question has been terminated for protocol violations. She accessed classified information and practiced medicine beyond her scope. I'm sure this hospital can provide." "I didn't ask for you." The SEAL didn't look at his hand. Didn't acknowledge the gesture. His eyes never wavered from scanning the room, and when they found nothing, he turned to the doorway. A woman in army dress blues appeared in the threshold, combat medal hanging from her uniform, clinical nursing officer insignia on her collar. Her face was weathered, her eyes the color of storm clouds. Major Walsh, formerly 75th Ranger Regiment, medical officer. Ramadi and Fallujah, 2 full deployments. Silver Star for Valor under fire. 2 Purple Hearts for combat wounds. She stepped into the room and her presence changed the air pressure, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. She would be here. She'd have come back to check on him. An older officer appeared behind her, his uniform a constellation of ribbon stretching from collar to pocket. "I'm Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, JSOC Command Liaison. I'm here to inform you that Major Walsh's discharge paperwork was never processed correctly due to administrative error. She was never actually separated from active duty. She's still Major Margaret Walsh, 75th Ranger Regiment, and she's still our responsibility." He turned to Caldwell with eyes like chips of ice. "Where is she?" Caldwell's voice was cracking now, the smooth silk fraying at the edges. "She was just a night nurse. She accessed your classified files. I had to. You had to nothing. Hayes' voice came from a depth of authority that made Caldwell physically step back. You had a decorated combat officer bleeding out on your unit because you falsified her discharge, buried her records, and reassigned her to a shift where she couldn't protect the patient under her care. A patient she'd already risked her life for in Ramadi 20 years ago. Marcus Chen appeared in the doorway with 2 FBI agents flanking him, carrying a hard drive that seemed to glow under the hospital lights. Security footage from the past 72 hours. Every deleted video, every falsified medical record, every piece of Dr. Caldwell's involvement in illegal combat drug trials. I'd got it all backed up to 4 separate locations and the bureau's already filed charges. Jackson's foster mother gasped from her chair in the corner, her hand covering her mouth, finally understanding what she'd witnessed in that moment during morning rounds when Dr. Caldwell had humiliated the gray-haired nurse with perfect diction and complete control. The SEAL leader pulled out his phone, dialed, waited 3 seconds, and turned it to speaker. A voice answered, professional, distant, the kind of voice that came from an office with flags. This is the White House Chief of Staff. Is this Major Walsh's location confirmed? The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator wheeze its mechanical rhythm. Dr. Caldwell reached for the door. The FBI agent blocked his path with casual certainty. We're not finished, Doctor, the agent said. But nobody was looking at Caldwell anymore. Every eye in the ICU had turned toward the empty doorway, toward the hallway beyond, as if Margaret Walsh might still walk through it at any moment. As if the quiet nurse who disappeared into the parking garage hadn't already been gone, already been broken, already been erased. And then, from somewhere deeper in the hospital, a phone rang. That evening, Margaret sat in her car in the parking garage of Oak Creek Memorial. Engine dead. Forehead pressed against the steering wheel. The leather was cold against her skin, and she couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. The dog tag hung beneath her scrubs, its metal chain pressing against her collarbone like a weight that might drag her under. Her phone buzzed. Then again. Then again. She didn't look. The eviction notice from the landlord's lawyer sat on the passenger seat, the date circled in red, 30 days. She had $847 in her checking account. She'd been terminated without severance. No references would come from Oak Creek Memorial. What hospital hired a nurse who accessed classified military files? What hospital hired a nurse whose presence triggered federal investigations? She pressed her forehead harder against the wheel, and for the first time in 20 years, her hands shook, not from fear, but from the kind of exhaustion that comes when you've spent 2 decades pretending to be someone you're not, and the lie finally breaks. The rain started then, hammering the windshield like shrapnel, and Margaret didn't move. Exactly 5 hours later, Jackson opened his eyes. The ICU was quiet at 0847. Most of the night shift had already gone home. The day team was just beginning their rounds, updating vitals, checking drips, the mechanical orchestra of intensive care humming its steady rhythm. Jackson's eyes moved first, a flutter beneath closed lids, then a slow, deliberate opening. The endotracheal tube had been removed 2 hours earlier. His lungs were clear. His O2 sat was 96 on room air. Stable. Healing. He turned his head toward the window where grey Houston morning was breaking, and then his eyes found the figure sitting motionless in the bedside chair. Margaret. She'd been there since 0300, after she'd finally left the parking garage. She'd gone home, showered off the shame and the parking garage, changed into fresh scrubs, same blue set she'd worn yesterday, the day before that. She'd come back to the hospital because there was nowhere else to go. Because a debt was a debt, and she owed Jackson more than a job. She owed him a witness. His voice came out thin, ragged from the tube, shaped by pain and recognition, Major Walsh. 3 words. The way he said them, not as a question, not as an accusation, but as a statement of absolute fact, changed the air in the room. Margaret's eyes opened. She'd been staring at her hands, at the surgical scars across her knuckles, at the calluses that no amount of hospital work could hide. She looked at Jackson's face and saw him clearly for the first time, the 8-year-old terrified boy she'd shielded with her own body during a compound raid in Ramadi in 2004, now grown into a man with a soldier's bearing even in a hospital bed. "You need to rest," Margaret said quietly. "I know who you are." His hand moved toward his neck, toward the dog tags that every American soldier wore. He pulled them aside, and beneath them, Margaret saw it, a thin, pale scar along his collarbone. The entry wound from shrapnel. The wound she'd packed with torn fabric in her own hands while dust from the compound rained down, and she counted his pulse to make sure he didn't bleed out before the medevac arrived. "You carried me 3 miles. Through the Jolan district. Through crossfire." His voice cracked. "You gave me your blood when the 4-pouch ran dry." Margaret's vision blurred. She tried to stand. Her legs didn't obey. "How did you?" she started. "My file. Dr. Caldwell left it open on his computer yesterday. The classified section." Jackson's eyes moved toward her. "Major M. Walsh. Silver Star. 2 Purple Hearts. Medical discharge, 2005. And then nothing. Like you disappeared." A pause. His breathing was shallow but steady. "But you didn't disappear. You were here all along. Pushing meds at 0300. Saving lives. Being invisible." Before Margaret could respond, the ICU doors burst open with the violence of purpose. A SEAL team leader in full dress uniform walked through, dress whites with ribbons across the chest, the kind of uniform you wore to ceremonies and courts martial and the kinds of moments that changed everything. He was flanked by 2 others, their presence making the hallway compress as if the air itself recognized authority. Dr. Caldwell had been standing at the nurse's station, reviewing charts. He looked up at the sound of boots, and the blood drained from his face like someone had pulled a plug. The SEAL team leader walked past him without acknowledgement. Without eye contact. The kind of dismissal that erased a person from existence. He approached Margaret's chair, and when she tried to stand, he held up one hand. "Major Walsh, on behalf of JSOC, you're requested at the presidential office immediately." His voice was precise, military, the kind of voice that didn't ask. It commanded. "Your Silver Star and 2 Purple Hearts have been upgraded. Retroactive to your medical discharge. And there's a ceremony that's 20 years overdue." Margaret didn't speak. She couldn't. The room had gone absolutely silent, the kind of silence you only heard when something fundamental shifted in the world's understanding of itself. Nurses stopped moving. The heart monitor's beep seemed impossibly loud. Jackson reached out and gripped Margaret's hand with surprising strength, and tears ran down his scarred face. The moment should have lasted longer. It didn't. The ICU doors opened again, and Marcus Chen walked through, his prosthetic hand glinting under the fluorescent lights. Behind him came 2 FBI agents in dark suits, their badges clipped to their belts like weapons. They moved with purpose toward Dr. Caldwell, who'd gone pale, not shock pale, but the color of a man watching his world collapse in real time. "Dr. James Caldwell, we need you to come with us," one of the agents said. "I don't. What is this?" Caldwell's voice had lost its arrogance. It sounded small now, thin as cigarette smoke. "We have a warrant for the server room and all digital records related to experimental medical trials conducted without proper informed consent on active duty personnel." The agent's words fell like a gavel. "We have evidence that you fabricated medical documentation, altered patient records, and attempted to silence a witness who discovered that evidence." Marcus Chen held up a small external hard drive. His face was steady, marine steady, the look of a man who'd been waiting for this moment and had arranged every piece with the precision of someone who understood how systems worked. Every deleted file restored. Every fabricated entry. Every pharmaceutical company phone call. And 23 hours of security camera footage showing you tampering with Jackson's medical charts and then systematically discrediting Major Walsh for accessing your classified files. Dr. Caldwell's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again with no words. The other doctors and nurses in the ICU had stopped working entirely. They stood frozen, watching a man watch his power evaporate like morning dew. The FBI agents gestured toward the door. Caldwell stood, and Margaret saw it then, the moment a bully realizes the world has changed and he's on the wrong side of it. His shoulders sagged. He moved like a man walking toward his execution, and in a way, he was. As they led him past Margaret's chair, he made a mistake. He looked at her. His eyes said everything he didn't have the courage to speak, the desperation, the fury, the understanding that he'd fought exactly the wrong person and lost. Margaret didn't look away. She held his gaze with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst this world could offer. She didn't need to say anything. Her silence was louder than any words. Then he was gone. The FBI agents escorted him through the ICU doors, and the hallway swallowed him whole. 6 months later, Margaret Walsh stood in her office at Oak Creek Memorial as Director of Trauma Services, a position that hadn't existed until the Pentagon and the hospital's board of directors realized they needed someone who understood what they'd nearly destroyed. The walls held her framed silver star, upgraded from a bronze after the medical review board determined that the circumstances of her combat service warranted the higher distinction. A photograph showed her shaking hands with the president in the Rose Garden. Jackson stood beside her in dress uniform, the scar above his eyebrow visible even in the official photo. Her nameplate read, Major Margaret Walsh, RN, Director of Trauma Services, Texas Medical Board Certified, JSOC Medical Advisor. On her desk, mounted in a shadow box of polished walnut, was the single dog tag on the broken chain, finally home, finally honored, finally where it belonged. The window of her office looked out over Houston. Rain fell again today, gentle this time, watering the city. In 6 months, she'd rebuilt the trauma protocols at Oak Creek Memorial. She'd implemented new safeguards for military personnel receiving experimental treatments. She'd hired 3 other medical veterans who'd been pushed out of civilian systems, people like her, people who'd learned to be invisible. And she'd started a program to identify nurses and doctors with hidden military service, because the healthcare system, she'd learned, was full of ghosts. People moving through the work half alive, hiding who they actually were because the civilian world didn't know how to honor what soldiers carried home. Across town, in a strip mall between a tax preparation service and a closed-down nail salon, Dr. Caldwell sat behind a folding table. His medical license had been permanently revoked pending the outcome of federal charges related to unauthorized medical trials. The pharmaceutical company that had paid him, discreetly, through shell corporations and offshore accounts, had cut him loose entirely. They produced emails showing he'd acted alone. They'd cooperated with the investigation. Justice moved slowly, but it moved. His attorney had advised him to take a job. Any job. Stay employed, stay clean, maybe the federal prosecutor would recommend a lighter sentence. So Caldwell sold insurance policies from a folding table in a strip mall, trying to convince people walking past to stop long enough to listen. Almost no one did. The ones who did looked at him with a kind of recognition that suggested they knew exactly what had happened to him and didn't care. He was invisible now. He understood what that felt like. The world had moved on. But not Margaret. Margaret was just beginning. She stood at her office window, her hand resting on the glass, watching the rain. Her hip ached, it always would, the legacy of an IED in 2004. Her hands were scarred. Her career had been broken and rebuilt. She'd lost everything and found it again in the last 6 months. And today, she'd received notice that a new program was being approved. A cohort of combat medics and experienced military personnel would be hired directly into the trauma department under her leadership. People like her. People like Marcus Chen. People who knew how to hold lives together in impossible moments. The phone on her desk buzzed with a message from the chief of medicine, first cohort interviews next month. We're building something new here, Margaret. Something that honors what these people know. Margaret touched the dog tag beneath her collar, the one on the broken chain, now mounted in its place of honor but still worn close to her heart. The metal was warm from her skin. She'd wear it until the day she died. It was proof that she'd lived, that she'd mattered, that the quietest person in the room had been holding it all together all along. She turned from the window and walked toward the ICU for evening rounds, her uniform crisp, her bearing straight, her limp barely noticeable. The nurses looked up when she approached. They stepped aside respectfully. They knew who she was now. They all knew. The door to the ICU opened, and Major Margaret Walsh walked through into the life she'd finally earned. Like and subscribe if you love stories about people who've been underestimated. Comment below if you've ever had someone doubt you and you proved them wrong. Let's get back to it.